The pasuk in Parshas Bamidbar tells us, "Ves Aaron ves bon of Tifkoid," you should appoint Aaron and his children, "V'shamru es kuhunasim," they should guard their kahuna, which we're going to see soon what this means. "Va'azara kariv yumos," and any foreigner that gets close should be put to death. Rashi explains the words "V'shamru es kuhunasim," that this refers to Kabbalas domim, receiving the blood, sprinkling the blood, burning the different parts of the korban on the mizbeach, haktorah, and avoidos hamesuros l'koydim, and the avoidos that are given over to the koydim. That means to say, Rashi is explaining the word v'shamru es kuhunasim, they should guard their avodah. The avoidos of the koyanim need to be guarded, not to allow a foreigner to go over, as the pasuk actually says further, v'azara kariv yumos. The Rebbe is bothered over here of why Rashi is explaining it in this particular way, because the Even Ezra explains v'shamru es kuhunasim very simply. They should guard their kahuna not to become puzzle, not to become tummy, for example. So why is Rashi learning that v'shamru es kuhunasim is referring to the special avodos that are given over to the koyanim? And the Rebbe says we cannot say that it's because of the end of the pasuk, va'azor hakarev yumos, the foreigner that gets close should be put to death, because we could clearly say there's two parts to the pasuk. V'shamru es kuhunasim, guard your own kahuna not to become puzzle. And another thing, hazor hakarev yumos, a foreigner that comes over should be put to death. Why do we have to say v'shamru es kuhunasim means that they should guard the avoidus of the kahuna? The Rebbe also asks, why are the words v'shamru es relevant in the Dibur HaMaschil? Rashi could have just translated the word kuhunasam, as meaning these particular avoidus. The Rebbe then asks and says, Rashi gives three examples: Kabbalas domim, receiving the blood, spraying the blood, haktorah, and offering it on the mizbeach. Rashi then says, and the avoidus that are given over to the koyanim. It seems to be that these three are examples for the avoidus given over to the koyanim. But the Rebbe says this is very, very difficult to say this way. First of all, Rashi could have just said avoidus hamesuros l'koyanim. Why does Rashi even need examples? Also says the Rebbe that Rashi could have just said simply all the avoidus starting from receiving the blood onwards. And why does Rashi need specifically three examples? The Rebbe also asks, the order in Rashi, when you're giving examples, you'd usually say the general idea, the avodah given to the koyanim, for example, these particular things. And most importantly, says the Rebbe, what is this expression, ve'avodos hamesuros l'koyanim, and the avodos, which sounds like it's something else? It should have said ushar avodos, and the rest of the avodos. Which the Rebbe says all of this implies that Rashi is actually telling us two different things. It's not examples one for the other. It's not that the avodah is given over to the koyanim and here are some examples receiving the blood, etc. Rather, the Rebbe is learning that Rashi is telling us two different things. There's one category of receiving the blood, sprinkling the blood and bringing it on the mizbeach. And then there's another category, the avodas that were given over to the koyanim. So we need to understand, what are we talking about? Clearly, these avodas are also part of what's given over to the koyanim. Rashi himself had told us earlier that starting from the receiving of the blood, that all belongs to the koyanim. And furthermore, the Rebbe says, if we do separate between these two sort of groups, that there's the avodas that are not part of what's given over to the koyanim, and there's the second group of avodas that are given over to the koyanim, where would Rashi get it from, or what would be the proof that when a pasuk says they should guard their kahuna, it's also referring to these other avodos, which seemingly are not part of the avodos hamesuros that are given over to the koyanim. So the first thing the Rebbe explains is why Rashi is not learning like the Even Ezra, which is that they should just guard themselves not to become puzzle. And the Rebbe says this is based on the beginning of the pasuk, where we said that you should appoint Tifkoid, Aaron and his children, which Rashi already, Tifkoid explained, it means appointing to a job. And therefore Rashi says if we're speaking now that they're getting an appointment to a job, we cannot say that this is referring to something that they actually know already from before. The concept not to become Tamei and Pasal, this was already said in Parshas Emoir. If the pasuk is now saying you should warn them, you should tell them, you should appoint them about this new thing, clearly we're speaking about something new, and that's why Rashi brings the words v'shamru es kuhunasam, which is clearly the point of what we're trying to make of it. There's going to be something new that they're going to guard over here. This is an expression of a new appointment to a new job. Because again, this is what they're being told now, something new that they weren't told before. And this is why Rashi is saying that we're referring to that they need to guard those avodos, as we mentioned before, that to make sure that only koyanim are going to do them. But what's bothering Rashi over here is something more than this. What's bothering Rashi is this whole section of Psukim is actually speaking about the Levium, the avoid of the Levium, the counting of the Levium, and so on. Suddenly, in the middle of all of this, we have a pasuk about Koyanim, and telling us, V'shamru esku nosam. How does this fit in over here? What are we saying about the Koyanim? That's going to tell us that there must have been something in these psukim which would have caused us to think that perhaps someone that's not a Kohen could actually do these avoides. In fact, we may have thought that the Levium could do these avoides of the Koyanim. How is that? On the pasuk, Mishmeres B'nai Yisrael, that the Levium are going to guard Mishmeres B'nai Yisrael, Rashi says that really all of the Yidden need to be involved in the Inyanim of the Beis HaMikdash, the needs of the Beis HaMikdash, etc. The Levium are working on behalf of the rest of the Yidden. They're their agents, they're their shluchim. So here we have a situation where you may have thought that certain avodos that perhaps maybe even Yisraelim could do, as we'll soon see what kind of avodos that might be. We may have thought if it's avodos that really technically belongs to Yisraelim, that maybe the Levim, who are the agents of Bnei Yisrael, should be allowed to be involved in this avodah and do these avodos. And this is why it's going to need to be important to say that no, even these kind of avodos, they are not allowed to do. And at the same time, Rashi is also going to tell us that there's also these other avodos, which are the avodas that are specifically given to Kohanim, the ones about which we have no doubt that only Kohanim could do. They are also included in these words, because when the pasuk says V'shamru esku nosam, and we are understanding that the Kohanim have to be guarding from certain avodas that the Levium shouldn't do them, of course it's also going to apply to the avodas that only Kohanim should do, and there isn't even any thought that anybody else should do it, that clearly this is part of the job of the Kohanim to guard that as well. So which avodos are we speaking about that we would have thought that perhaps Levium should be able to do them on behalf of Bnei Yisrael? So we find earlier in the Torah about the Korban Pesach. The pasuk says, "V'lakchu min adam," they should take the blood and put it on the two doorposts and eat the meat, roast it on the fire, etc. Here we have that the Bnei Yisrael were actually involved in these very avodos that Rashi specifies. V'lakchu es adam, they take the blood. Rashi himself tells us that it means it's the avodah of Kabbalah, receiving the blood. They put them on the doorposts. That was like instead of sprinkling on the Mizbeach. Then they burn in the fire, roasted in the fire. This is like burning on the Mizbeach. So we would have thought that in karbonos that are similar to the Korban Pesach, maybe these are avodas that technically Yidden are allowed to do, and definitely the Levium over here should be allowed to do them on their behalf as their agents. And this is what the pasuk is coming to tell us. While we were just speaking about the fact that the Levium are the shluchim of the Bnei Yisrael, we immediately need to be saying that this does not belong to the Levium, the Kohanim, the Yisraelim, that the Levium cannot do this on behalf of the Yisraelim. Now, even though we learned already earlier that starting from Kabbalah, from the receiving of the blood, belongs to the Kohanim, but we may have thought that's only regarding those karbonis where it specifies it, like the Korban Oila, etc. But maybe in a Korban Pesach and other such karbonis, maybe we would be allowed to appoint the Levium to have them do it for us, and that's why it's important to say over here that no, the Levium cannot do this avodah. The Rebbe concludes with the Ha'irah in the following way. If when we speak about Yidden who are all holy, Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kodesh, nevertheless, avodah that belongs to a Kohen cannot be done by anyone else, and is very, very severe and strict. V'azor HaKorev Yumos is put to death, Chas v'Shalom. How much more so when we speak about the separation between Yidden and Goyim, the Rebbe is referring over here to the famous concept of Giyur Ka'alocha, that a conversion must be done in a proper way. And when it's not done in a proper way, you're trying to remove that boundary. Then you're not doing anyone a favor, certainly not the Yid, but not even the Goy, because as we said, V'azor HaKorev Yumos, anybody that gets close to an area that doesn't belong to him is causing damage to himself, to the world, to everyone around him. And only when we don't touch those borders that the Eibishter made which some mavdil ben Yisrael amim, that's the way we can have true peace and good in the world for every single person in the world.